School is back in session. Youngsters are already back, and college students at Oregon's public universities return in coming days. Where do things stand with, everything? I'm Andrew Thien, and this is Beat Check with the Oregonian. Up next, Sami Edge, higher education reporter for the Oregonian and OregonLive. First off, we talked about those younger kids and what we know and don't know about just how far behind they are in achieving key reading and math-related milestones. Then, we talked about the many changes in higher education, why community colleges are struggling, and how the state is trying to open doors to tribal members. Here's our conversation. Sami Edge, thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here and excited to be at the Oregonian.
We are very excited to have you, and we've been enjoying reading your stuff so far. A lot to dive into. The youngsters, primary school kids, are back in classrooms across Oregon now, and college students return to public universities later this month. Before we talk about that stuff, higher ed, your beats, you pinch hit and wrote about a very important story that we're just kind of starting to understand as a society, and that's learning loss due to the pandemic. Could you tell us about Haley Floyd and her daughter and their story?
Yeah, so Haley Floyd is a parent in the David Douglas School District in, I think that's in Northeast Portland. I'm still getting oriented around here. And her story was pretty emotional. She's the parent of a kid who has just started in the fourth grade. And something that we hear frequently as education reporters is how critical the third grade age is for reading. Mm-hmm. Before that, students are learning to read. And then after third grade, they're expected to be reading to learn. So getting those reading skills up to par around third grade is really important. And last year, when Haley's daughter was in the third grade, she realized that her kiddo was still struggling with some sight words that she was supposed to have learned in first grade. So she was really quite concerned that her daughter was behind, tapped into her savings account to pay for a reading tutor this summer, and was really just hoping that when her kiddo went back to school this year and started fourth grade, the teacher could kind of assess where she was at and see that hopefully she had made some progress.
Okay, so I think a lot of people can probably identify with Haley Floyd's story and her daughter, right? I mean, she's working. It's hard to help your kids when you're working full time and trying to pay the bills, right? I mean, her story is one that's kind of emblematic about the broader picture in Oregon, right?
Certainly. That was something I didn't mention was Haley was working during the pandemic. So even when her daughter was at home, she was trying to help her with school, trying to focus on her job. That's a struggle, right? Their story is emblematic of where we are because there's been a lot of concern around learning loss, but we don't quite have the data yet to know exactly where we are in Oregon. So just as Haley was, hoping as she goes back to school this fall, her daughter's teacher will give her a sense for where they are. We're waiting this fall to get a sense for where Oregon students are in general.
Yeah, that's one of those unsatisfying things in journalism or life where it's like, we don't know. We know there's an issue, but we have to wait for the experts and, the actual data to come through and show the extent of the problem.
Sure. We have some national data that shows that pandemic learning loss has been a real issue, particularly for some priority populations who were already disproportionately disadvantaged in school. But I think maybe next week we'll get some state data on how far Oregon's kids may have been set back by the pandemic and how much they may have managed to catch up, since that first year of remote learning.
So how are districts and nonprofits who help students in the school system trying to help kids catch up?
Yeah, well, I think the biggest thing I can point to right now is lots of summer school. That was a big deal for kids this past year, in particular this past summer. The Beaverton School District told me that they had pretty much tripled enrollment in summer school, and I think 17% of their students were in summer school this past summer. So
wow, that's a big amount.
Well, it's a challenge when you expect students to make a year's worth of progress during the school year, right? But now if they have more than a year's worth of progress to make up, either the school year has to be extra intensive or they need some extra time to do that.
You mentioned a little bit earlier talking about sight words like friends, a word that a sight word basically, a kid might not know how to read, but they need to recognize that word when they see it. And, that's kind of one of the building blocks. My understanding as someone who has a kindergartner trying to figure out all this stuff. But what other skills are kids kind of falling behind expectations now from what you've heard just on your reporting?
Well, what we know at this point, based on national research, is that students lost ground in both math and reading during the pandemic, and that low income youth and historically marginalized students were impacted the most. Nationally, reading scores among 9-year-olds, which is, that critical third to fourth grade age group, saw the steepest drop in 30 years during the pandemic. The test that revealed those 9-year-old drops also showed that math scores dropped for the first time in that time period.
It's a lot. It's a lot to make up, and we're all still trying to grapple, I think, with what we've all been through as adults in the past 2 years, let alone children. It's got to be a very bizarre time.
Yeah, and national studies do suggest that student learning kind of rebounded during the 21-22 school year when students were back in buildings. There were pandemic protocols, but they weren't always at home. I spoke with some folks at nonprofits who told me that they have recognized that the very youngest students seem to be catching up fastest. Just kind of encouraging because that population, I think researchers were really worried about. So it does seem to look like the youngest students are catching up faster maybe than the older students.
Well, let's turn to higher education and those students who are exiting the primary school system and heading on to post-secondary education. It's a new era, and there's a lot of new beginnings and new leaders in the state that you've been writing about in recent weeks and months. Can you kind of talk about some of the changes that have happened? And is this just one of those times where there's not something else going on other than there's just rotating chairs at the top positions?
Well, there's lots going on and rotating chairs. So it's an exciting time to step into this higher education beat. We have a new president at Oregon State. We have a new president at Portland Community College. I know that there are several others that I have not yet covered. Lane Community College has a new president. And we just found out recently that the University of Oregon is going to be hiring a new president after Michael Schill went to be the new president of Northwestern in Illinois. So there's a lot of change coming there. And also, we're seeing higher education institutions have to navigate a new normal after the pandemic, just like our K-12 schools. From what I can see, the impact of the pandemic has been acutely felt at community colleges in particular. They've seen really steep enrollment declines and are trying to figure out how to chart a path forward without a lot of the enrollment that kind of makes up their baseline funding.
I have a little bit of knowledge from writing about higher ed previously, and it's basically like community college enrollment tends to track with the economy, right? Is that one of the reasons, in terms of the unemployment is extremely low right now? Is that one of the reasons that that community college is seeing enrollment decline, or are there other factors going on?
Yeah, I think that's certainly one of the reasons that they're seeing enrollment decline right now. But also the pandemic kind of threw a wrench in all of their traditional models for expecting what enrollment could do. Because right at the beginning of the pandemic, we saw a little bit of a recession, right? It was pretty short-lived. But historically, that would suggest that students were going to enroll in colleges because that's what we've seen in the past. And instead of that happening, enrollment just really plummeted. Perhaps that's because schools were moving online and people weren't as interested in going back to school during a recession if they had to do it online. So we saw steep drops there. And then the job market got competitive. So we really have yet to see kind of a return to normal enrollment. And also, we've been seeing enrollment declines broadly over the last decade or so since the Great Recession. So, it really is a new era in terms of low enrollment at community colleges and what the plan is moving forward to either appeal to more students or restructure that landscape so that it is economical and making the most sense to meet the state's needs.
Yeah, you've done some really interesting reporting in recent weeks on the community college and both the enrollment piece that you just talked about, but also kind of the various levers that the state is trying to pull to make it more enticing. And can you talk a little bit about some of the financial aid work that that the state is trying to take part in, I guess, or encourage to draw more people to community colleges? Because, you know, the Oregon Promise, some listeners might have a little bit of a knowledge about, but it seems like there's more effort to try to get more bodies in classrooms, so to speak.
It's been kind of exciting, I think, to see that financial aid is a big talking point. Oregon for a long time was kind of at the bottom of the pack in terms of financial aid allocations to students. It has made some progress. I don't think we're on the very lowest end of state financial aid, but we are still below the national average, which I believe in 2021, most states gave around $920 in financial aid to most full-time students, and Oregon's funding level was closer to $600. So we're definitely below the norm. The Higher Education Coordinating Commission, which is essentially the state governance body for higher ed, right? They're really focused on that funding piece this year. They just released a budget request that would basically quadruple state funding for student aid and kind of take Oregon from a marginal state to one of the best in the country for per student funding on that financial aid front. That is very much in the early stages.
Right.
we'll get a new governor this fall, and she'll have to review that budget request before it even goes to the legislature. So it's a long shot that we get that much more funding, but I suppose we'll see. In the meantime, the state has, made some moves to make financial aid and higher education more accessible. You mentioned Oregon Promise. That is the state grant that ostensibly makes community college free for students. It does have some barriers to entry. You have to meet a certain GPA requirement. It's only for high schoolers who very immediately enroll in community colleges the fall after they graduate. But this year, the legislature reduced that GPA requirement from 2.5, which is, I think, a C average, to 2.0. So, we could see far more students qualifying for that aid this year. And research has shown that could be a particular benefit to students of color and low-income students who are, generally have less opportunities to pursue higher education.
There's so many unanswered questions, but I loved how you said we will have a governor and she will play a role. Obviously, that's one of the only things we know. The next governor will be a woman. Just sticking with the state funding piece, you've reported. This is going back quite a ways, but it's an important story just about how the state is trying to make inroads to tribal members to open higher education doors there. Can you talk about some of the stories that you had on that front and maybe some of the people you talked to and how they might be taking advantage of that program?
Yeah, this year, the legislature, I think, put $19 million into the Oregon Tribal Student Grant, and it's pretty unique in the country from what I could tell from my reporting. Basically, a member of any of Oregon's tribes can access these funds to pay for most of their higher education. And the grants kind of pay average cost at a school, which is much different than just covering tuition. Average cost also includes books and housing and that kind of stuff. So it really could help pay for the majority of folks' higher education costs this next year. And it's not just for tribal high school students. It's for anybody who's an enrolled member of a tribe and wants to go pursue higher education if they want to finish a degree they started, or maybe they never got the chance to do higher ed and want to try it for the first time. They can access these funds. But like I said, I didn't see another state that was offering this this level of funding for tribal members. There are some states that offer free tuition for tribal members, but that's, only a chunk of the higher ed cost broadly.
Yeah, and as you reported, there's something like more than 29,000 members of federally recognized tribes who live in Oregon and might qualify for, for this program.
Yeah, and I know that the application is still open, so the state certainly hasn't run out of money yet. So if anybody's listening and they haven't yet had the opportunity to put in their application, I'd say go for it.
I'm curious what it's been like for you, Sami, kind of covering this beats when it's, this weird time. And now we're kind of finally feeling more like a sense of normalcy, I guess. And students obviously have been back on campuses for a while. But like, what's it been like for you trying to wrap your head around this and as a reporter and just planning out your reporting as the school year begins in earnest?
Yeah, well, it's a new beat for me. I was a K-12 reporter before, so that was helpful for laying some of the groundwork. And while I just moved back to the state, I did attend the University of Oregon a while back, so at least I've got some some ground level knowledge on that front. It's been fun, but also somewhat challenging to figure out where these institutions are after the pandemic. I think we're really seeing a mixed bag. My understanding is that enrollment at the flagships this year is not hurting anywhere near the same way that community colleges are. It's been interesting to try and map out the landscape and figure out the unique identity of, more than 20 different institutions across the state.
With a ton of, like we mentioned at the top, a ton of leadership changes too, at so many schools. Certainly. I mean, it's, one of the pieces that you, reported recently, includes another school that has a leadership change at the top, and that's, a private institution, University of Portland up on the bluff in North Portland. But can you kind of describe that piece? Because it was really fascinating to me that the school is like in the hole because a lot of kids have who said they were going to come aren't coming, right? Can you kind of describe what exactly is happening at UP?
Certainly, and I'll preface this for listeners that my beat is mostly access and equity in higher ed and mostly community colleges, so don't expect a lot from me on this private university front. There are just too many schools to keep track of. But I did think that this was an interesting and kind of important story at UP. The school expected to have, I think, almost record enrollment in its freshman class this year. And generally, it sees some students drop off over the summer, right? Students who said they were going to come in the fall. They send out bills in the summer. Mm-hmm. Students decide it's too expensive and withdraw. My understanding is that's usually about 7%. This year they saw 3 times that. So about 21% of students who put money down backed out.
Wow.
And they ended up with one of their smallest freshman classes in a while. Leadership isn't exactly sure why yet. They won't until later this fall have an understanding of whether those students went elsewhere or didn't enroll anywhere. And it took them by surprise because, it looked like it was going to be a turnaround year after some lower than average class sizes during the pandemic. And then so many students backed out that they got hit with this surprise deficit. I want to say it was about 8.9 million. They're about 8.9 million behind where they expected to be this fall.
Yeah, I would be surprised too. And that seems like that would catch you off guard. Well, I mean, there's just so much. It's such an interesting time for you to be on this beat. Like you mentioned the kind of the lens that you're looking at your stories, and I'm just curious. Obviously, President Biden took action a couple weeks ago now. At this point, I don't know what is time, something like that, to cancel debt for a lot of people and with various criteria, but Pell Grant recipients were going to receive more forgiveness. Have you had any conversations with anyone locally about that and how it's changed their financial situation? Or do you have any thoughts on how it might just affect all of the things we talked about previously in terms of enrollment going forward?
Yeah, I will say I haven't done too much on loan forgiveness personally. Um, but I can imagine, mostly for obviously this is a boon for graduates who've come out of programs with a lot of debt and are trying to pay that off. Um, I mean, I can only imagine that it's huge, right? We're all dealing right now with escalated inflation, and then having loan debt on top of rent and car payments and insurance payments. It's
Right.
just so much to deal with. So I think it's a weight off of many people's shoulders.
What else should I have asked you, Sammy, about your reporting and just kind of the stories that you've told recently or looking to tell? There's so much to talk about. I appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah. Well, in the next couple weeks, I'll be working on a back to school story for higher ed, really focused on, how has the pandemic impacted student preparedness for college, particularly for students who were in high school during the pandemic and lived through some of those disruptions. Um, I've been talking to some universities about that. I also just wrote a story today. We're talking on Friday, September 16th,
Right.
about the way that community colleges are kind of getting involved in expungement efforts to help folks who were convicted of crimes in the past but eligible to have those crimes wiped off their record, get that paperwork done and get that process taken care of. And that was a really interesting story for me because I hadn't yet thought about that role of community colleges in really breaking down all sorts of barriers to people's, education and also employment. Having a criminal record can be a huge issue for employment, and getting that paperwork done is scary and hard and used to be very costly. So it's been interesting to see that role of community colleges really, taking on that legal advice in addition to everything else they do for Oregonians.
Yeah, and thanks for bringing that up, because what I loved about that piece is the main anecdote you used was a man in his 60s, I believe, Forrest Beasley, who is kind of emblematic that of these community colleges. They're not. It's not just an 18 to 22-year-old, right? I mean, they serve the community. And can you talk about what his story was, if you got it in your brain somewhere?
Oh, absolutely. I just spoke with Forrest recently and he was delightful. I will preface with, Forrest is not, he's not a community college student, but, community colleges are offering these services for people broadly.
Right.
Forrest is, yeah, in his mid 60s, is a drug and alcohol counselor, I believe, for a nonprofit in Lane County. Um, and he himself has 15 felonies on his record for dealing drugs when he was younger, much younger. He got kicked out of the house as an adolescent and was living on the streets and got into addiction and began selling drugs and then went to prison and turned his whole life around. He's been sober for 33 years. When he first heard that there was a clinic in Oregon City where he could talk to some people who could help him get these off his record, he thought it was a prank. he that's the anecdote at the beginning of the story, was he wondered if it was like one of those bounty hunter shows where they convince you've won a prize and then you show up and they arrest you. And yeah, he said, if that's the case, just tell me and I'll turn myself in because I don't live that life anymore. And Forrest showed up and people helped him fill out the paperwork to get these things expunged from his record. And it was really important for him, not because at this point in his life he's facing any employment challenges or education challenges, which many people with criminal records are.
Mm-hmm.
But for him, he's worked through the steps of AA, and one of those things is forgiveness, going back and making amends to people you've wronged. And for him, this felt like he'd finally made amends with the state. He can be free of these charges soon because he has worked hard to give back to his community and live a good life. And now this is kind of a weight off of him.
Well, it was a great story. We'll share a link in the episode notes. And thanks for your work on that one and all of the previous stuff we discussed. It's been great to have your voice on the beat, and we look forward to chatting more soon.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to Beat Check with the Oregonian. I shared links to some of Sami's recent stories in the episode notes, including her piece about community colleges helping residents expunge past convictions from their record. If you like this show, give us a 5-star rating and review in Apple Podcasts. It really helps others find the show. And tell a friend. Help spread the word. The best way to support our journalism is through a subscription to Oregon Live. You can do that at OregonLive.com/pod support. Until next time.